This webinar is talking about FEMA and assistance during this disaster. As you know, the president has declared Texas a disaster area, the governor as well. And there may be assistance for us, particularly as not-for-profit organizations. I want to introduce some folks from Tidal Basin. They're a consulting firm that has worked on a number of disasters around the country, and some here in Texas. I'm going to introduce Don Force. He's the state director at Tidal Basin. He covers Texas, and he's had extensive experience in dealing with disasters in the state and other places as well. He's familiar with us. He worked for 16 years at the Texas legislature. And so I'm going to turn over to Don, and he's going to introduce our main speakers.
Thank you, George. Again, my name is Don Force. I'm the state director for Tidal Basin. Real quick background info on our company. Tidal Basin is a national disaster consulting firm. We've been in business this year for 35 years, and we do everything on the disaster cycle, from preparedness, training, exercising, hazard mitigation plans on the front end prior to disaster, and then do extensive work post-disaster with recovery grants through HUD community development block grants, as well as FEMA public assistance. FEMA public assistance in particular is one of our core competencies. It is an area that we have been in probably the longest, and are one of the leading national firms, if not the leading national firm, when it comes to FEMA public assistance. We've got a significant footprint in Texas with FEMA PA. We've got several clients that go all the way back as far as to Hurricane Rita in 2005. We also have a significant healthcare footprint here in the state with FEMA PA. We've done work, or are currently doing work for entities such as Memorial Hermann System, Texas Children's Hospital, the healthcare institutions for the University of Texas system, and we're also the endorsed partner for disaster preparedness and recovery through the Texas Hospital Association. George mentioned I worked with your organization quite extensively when I was with the Texas legislature. Had a long-standing relationship with George and David, and so when this hit, knowing the types of facilities that y'all had and they would be eligible for FEMA public assistance reimbursement, I reached out to David. Just wanted to make sure that we got this information to your members. The two folks that are going to be taking over after I stop talking are Alan Davis, who is our Director of Recovery and handles everything with FEMA Public Assistance, and Christopher Prickett, who is our Director of Healthcare Services. He's an old FEMA hand and has got extensive experience in coordinating healthcare institutions with FEMA. So at this point, probably best to turn it over to Alan. And I'll hang around. My contact information will be at the end of this. So if anybody has any questions for me, just feel free to contact me at any time. Alan, you on?
Yeah, I am. Hey, Chris, did you want to introduce yourself before I jump into the presentation?
Yeah, no problem. So I'm Chris Prickett, the Director of Healthcare Services. Like Don said, I'm formerly, before I came to FEMA, or to Tidal Basin, I was formerly with FEMA. I was a program manager as well as a healthcare liaison. I worked between, liaising between private healthcare entities and DHS and FEMA, as well as the CDC and Health and Human Services at the federal level, trying to increase our preparedness for an incident just like we're experiencing today for some type of large-scale national or global pandemic. In addition, before that, I was an emergency manager for a big trauma system in Atlanta, where my system had about 7 long-term care homes associated to it. So I'm very familiar with the trials and tribulations that you're going through right now, especially when it comes to your PPE concerns and your concerns for your residents and things like that, as well as your staff members and your patients. So before I give it back to Alan, who I have kind of dumped this presentation on because he is the true subject matter expert for all the financial recovery services, I would like to say thank you to Alan for taking the time to do this, as well as I will be available, just like Don, to answer any questions after the fact. I will probably be the primary point of contact for you. My information will be at the end of the presentation, and I'll be available to answer questions after the presentation as well.
Thanks, Chris. As Don and Chris mentioned, I'm the Director of Recovery for Tidal Basin. Formerly, I was with FEMA for about 12 years, most recently out here in Region 9 in California. I'm in San Diego County. Before that, I actually started in Region 6, right there in Texas. I grew up in a little town south of Houston called Alvin. And my folks are still there, and luckily they're safe, but I'm out here in California, although I, until recently, haven't been home very much. But I do this public assistance training pretty regularly, both for Tidal Basin, and before that I would do workshops and 2 or 3 days, sometimes 2-week classes out in the Pacific twice a year for FEMA. So our 20 some odd slide presentation today is an extremely abbreviated version of all of that. But the purpose of this call is, or presentation, is just to get everybody feeling comfortable with the program, let you know generally what might be eligible and how we might be able to assist everyone. In addition to that, it's an opportunity for us to just have a discussion. So as we work our way through this, if there's something that I say that doesn't make sense, if there's an acronym that I use that doesn't make sense, we all tend to get into this weird acronym style language just because we've been doing it for decades, and it can get confusing. So please slow me down or click the little chat function. I'm going to try to have that up during the presentation and address questions as they come up. If someone happens to see a question that I don't get to, please stop me and ask me to address anyone's concern that we think would be for the greater good. So before we jump into this, does anybody have any questions? Are we good to get started? All right, no objections. Let's do it. So fun fact, I was actually quarantined for 2 weeks. They suspected I had COVID-19. They tested me. I went in to get a prescription refill for my asthma medication, and instead they noted my fever and put me on quarantine. So I've been on quarantine for a couple extra weeks prior to our statewide quarantine. And believe it or not, I had short hair before this quarantine started, but I'm kidding. I can't hear your laughs. I'm just going to assume my jokes are funny. Okay, here we go. So FEMA PA 101. As I said, this is generally a 2 or 3 day class. We just put a bunch of new recruits on Tidal Basin's team.
Hey, Alan, we can't hear you.
Hey, Alan, do you want to try to call in using the phone audio?
So
Oh, we can hear you now.
I'm getting all kinds of errors here.
Wait.
So sorry about that, guys. It's just error after error at this point.
All right.
Let me jump back into this presentation because it looks like you guys are picking me up. Am I going in and out, or am I consistently?
Right now you're consistent.
Okay. All right. Let's see if we can limp through this. Like I said, this is only a 20 slide presentation thereabout. We're taxing my poor little computer here, but I will endeavor to get through this, and if we need to do it again, we'll do it again. So apologies for the delay.
No worries. Real quick, if everyone who unmuted themselves, if you can mute yourself back, that would be great, just while Alan is talking. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for that, Amanda. Okay, so our main areas of focus are going to be generally on the PA program, get everybody feeling comfortable with what the public assistance program entails, what process we as a team will be following if we decide to engage with one another, generally what types of costs may be eligible and what you can expect out of the program, and then answer some questions. So the process normally looks like this. We sort of have a different picture of how this process might move forward, because FEMA has rightly so issued declarations well in advance. Normally they do what they call a preliminary damage assessment, which essentially goes out, verifies that states and local agencies have experienced damage or impact from an event to such an extent that they are unable to respond themselves effectively. And therein lies justification for a major disaster declaration. Luckily, the Trump administration has been really, really fast. I've never seen in my 12, 13 years doing this, an administration as fast as they have been in making these declarations. So that's great. That's great for us because we saw the emergency declaration nationwide right off the bat. And I think Texas, did you guys, maybe someone can answer this question, but I believe the Texas governor made a request for a major disaster declaration, similar to the state of New York and California.
Yes, he did. He did, and it was granted.
Okay, so it was granted. So we've got a major disaster declaration. The implications of that aren't too significant. It may involve an increase in the federal cost share, but generally we're still looking at only Category B emergency protective measures. That may sound foreign, but we'll get into it. So for all intents and purposes, we've got our declaration. After that, the state normally would host an applicants briefing. Now, because of the nature of the event being a pandemic, I imagine if that does happen, it will be done remotely or virtually through some sort of GoToMeeting or Skype, or maybe even just a phone call. I've personally been involved in doing virtual applicants briefings with the state when I was with FEMA out in California. So request for public assistance is the RPA is your ticket into the program. So I'm not sure how many of the organizations involved with LeadingAge, or if LeadingAge has been an applicant before. Can someone nod or give me a thumbs up if they've been an applicant for PA before? Doesn't sound like it.
I would think that some of our members down in the Houston area were probably applicants after Hurricane Harvey.
Okay, so that's good news.
This is Marcia. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can.
Can you? Oh, okay, yes. No, we are recipients for Hurricane Harvey, and we're very familiar with Category B. It's not a hard process, and we're glad to have somebody to help us get through it. It would be nice to have a firm to help guide you, because they'll even be more compressed and compact trying to handle all of these grants and stuff. So just to let you know, 7 Acres has been extremely successful with our grant for Hurricane Harvey, and it is saving us today.
Wonderful. So that's great. It's great to hear that there's some experience with the program. It's unfortunate that we have to have had experience in this program, but we'll consider that a silver lining. Because it can be complicated, and it can be challenging, because I know everybody's already taxed, right? Our capacity is very limited to take on additional work. So we're all wearing, 2, 3, 4, 5 hats in all of this. So I completely understand where you guys might be challenged throughout this effort. So within 30 days of the disaster declaration, FEMA your request for public assistance is due to the state and FEMA. So they will review your RPA and make an eligibility determination, but as long as we're a 501c3 healthcare institution, I imagine we're not going to have any challenges getting approved. After that happens, FEMA schedules, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm going to move it around on my screen. FEMA schedules the recovery scoping meeting within 20 days of RPA approval. Now, that sounds like a pretty short timeline. I can't imagine that FEMA is going to be getting to the recovery scoping meetings too quickly. And in fact, based on some simplified guidance that I've seen come out of FEMA headquarters, I imagine they might not even have scoping meetings. We may be doing all of this virtually and simply being given guidance from FEMA in terms of how to get the program kick-started. So that recovery scoping meeting is really just a kickoff meeting. It's your first substantive meeting with FEMA. They tell you what the expectations are and what documentation they need from you to get the projects written. Those meetings, we as consultants really like to attend. Sometimes FEMA has a sense of urgency that results in maybe shortcutting a lot of the process. And when we shortcut this process, I think certain costs and impact sort of slip through the cracks. So it's our job to sort of dial it back and say, hey, let's take a holistic view and make sure that nothing gets missed. Once that happens, we jump right into the sub-award formulation stage. Really all that consists of is writing project worksheets. You'll hear us refer to these sub-grant applications as project worksheets or PWs. That's really just your funding mechanism. To answer a question I heard earlier, I can't remember who asked it, you only have to apply for the program once under each disaster. So once we get that RPA in for this declaration, you're in the program. After that, then we can write as many project worksheets as we need to address all of the impact for each of LeadingAge's organizations. The way we meet that 60-day damage identification requirement in that first bubble under subaward formulation is through what FEMA calls the damage inventory. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a spreadsheet that captures all of the potential expenses that each of your organizations may have incurred in response and recovery to this pandemic event. So once we get that done, we'll formulate all of those damages into specific project worksheets or subgrant applications or PWs. Those projects will work their way through FEMA's grants portal system, be reviewed by a number of different people through the review queues, and eventually make it to obligation. And then once we've addressed all of your projects, FEMA will conduct an exit briefing. So after all of that's done, a bunch of other things might happen. So FEMA will obligate your projects. You can request drawdowns from the state, from TDIM, I believe. There's a closeout process, there's an audit process, an appeal process if those things happen to occur, so on and so forth, but we won't get too heavy into the post-award activities until we maybe get there. So as we mentioned, the PA program is a reimbursement program. It's designed to reimburse eligible applicants for their expenses related to a major disaster or emergency disaster declaration. For us, it sounds like we've got a major disaster declaration, so that's good. I think our incident period for that major disaster declaration will be... We have a question? I'm getting some feedback from somebody.
Just a reminder, for those of you who are calling in on your phones, if you can hit mute on your phone as well, that would be helpful. Thank you. Thanks,
Amanda. Great. So grant money provided by the feds flows through the state or the recipient. The super circular that came out a while back sort of renamed the different entities as far as federal grant programs are concerned. So we'll refer to the state as either the grantee or the recipient or just the state. The money flows through the state down to the subgrantee or subrecipient, which in this case would be LeadingAge. I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe that the federal cost share for these declarations is 100%, but I'm not positive how that's going to be structured. Sometimes they say it'll be 100% for a certain period of time or certain types of expenses, but in this case, let's say that we have no less than a 75% federal cost share with a high likelihood that that's been increased. Oftentimes the non-federal share, so if it is a 75% cost share, that non-federal share is often split with the state. I forget how TDIM does it, but out here in California, the state picks up 75% of that 25%, so whatever that math works out to. But if this is 100% federal cost share, then we don't have to really worry about that. So the difference between an emergency declaration and a major disaster declaration really doesn't have an impact on us for this particular event, because generally the only main difference is that a major disaster declaration turns on our other categories of work. We mentioned categories of work. They throw their projects into two big buckets, emergency work and permanent work, and then they sub-categorize those projects a little further. So emergency work categories are categories A and B. A is for debris removal and B is emergency protective measures. That category B is what we're focusing on here. And then under a major disaster declaration, if applicable, you'll get the other categories of work, which include your infrastructure damage. But fortunately, we don't have to deal with that at this point in time. Although we did just have an earthquake in Northern California, so never say never. Post-disaster declaration activities. We sort of touched on some of these earlier, so we'll have our applicants briefing. If that happens, I have seen some communication flying around from other regions out there indicating that they might be holding applicants briefings, but at a minimum, our biggest concern is getting those requests for public assistance into the state and or FEMA as soon as we can. That way we get our foot in the door before that, I think it's April 15th deadline. But even so, there's a little bit of flexibility with that. I personally worked as Deputy Federal Coordinating Officer on a handful of events out in the Hawaiian Islands and Guam and Samoa and the Marianas, and I don't think I've ever denied a request for public assistance that was turned in after that 30-day mark, back when I was with FEMA. However, like again, never say never, but I think this particular event we might see some flexibility.
Hey, Alan.
Go ahead.
This is Don. Just wanted to let you know, applicant briefings started yesterday. They are going to be held daily at 1 p.m. Virtually until further notice. So they're doing daily applicant briefings now going forward.
Great, thank you, Don. I appreciate that. I wish I had the same information for the state of California, because I get asked multiple times a day. So that's great. If you have the information as to how these folks can all participate in those applicants briefing, I'm sure everybody would appreciate it, including myself. I'd love to sit in on one. So once the applicants briefing takes place and we turn in our request for public assistance, FEMA does what they call an exploratory call. It's exactly what it sounds like. In fact, they might call you to set up and schedule the phone call. As funny as that sounds. Maybe it might be an email, but that call is just to set the expectation and to let everybody know what to bring to the recovery scoping meeting. And now, since all of this is virtual, you're not bringing anything anywhere, but just to be prepared to discuss a certain amount or type of information with your FEMA rep at the recovery scoping meeting. After that happens, obviously your RSM takes place, and then we start developing your subgrant applications or project worksheets or PWs. Good thing is that FEMA is prepared. I actually was part of the design and implementation team for FEMA Grants Portal. It actually works pretty well. I got to hand it to them. It's a heck of a lot better than what they used to use. But all of these things take place within FEMA's Grants Portal. And I actually teach a class on Grants Portal as well, so we can assist at any level with using that system. So we talked a little bit about the RPA, don't need to get too in depth, but it's basically your ticket into the program. It's due within 30 days of the declaration. In this case, normally you would see a declaration come out and identify counties that are eligible for the program under that declaration. Now this is a little different. Every major disaster declaration I've seen so far includes every county in the state. I haven't looked at Texas's major disaster deck yet, but if I were to guess, I would guess that every county in the state is included and outlined in that declaration. But then again, never say never. Those RPAs are reviewed and approved between the FCO, the Federal Coordinating Officer, the State Coordinating Officer, and sometimes delegated to the FEMA Public Assistance Group Supervisor. So we talked about categories of work. Unless anybody wants to spend a little more time on it, we can, but generally, what we're going to be concerned with on this disaster declaration is your category B, emergency protective measures. That's your life, health, safety type activities. That's really what we're going to focus on. The COVID-19 emergency declarations were all backdated to January the 20th. That's a good thing. However, it does not preclude us from claiming anything that may be outside of that time period. And you'll notice the incident period says continuing, meaning we don't know when this thing is going to end. What FEMA does is they will rely on the authority and whatever the peril is to make a determination when to close that incident period. So maybe in this case, it's the CDC. I'm not sure, but I would guess it's the CDC. They'll say, hey, CDC liaison, when do we consider this pandemic under control to such an extent that we need to close the incident period, essentially putting a window, giving us a window as far as how to claim our expenses. Like I said, just because expenses were incurred outside of that window doesn't mean that they're not eligible, but it is a pretty good indicator. The EM emergency decks were all issued on the 13th of March. And it sounds like the major disaster declaration was issued either today or just a handful of days ago. So what is Category B? This is a list of examples. By no means is this an exhaustive list. There are so many different things that are unique to each of our agencies that we work with that don't show up on anybody else's list because your situation may be unique. I know that LeadingAge may have a different way of doing business and may have different needs in response and recovery from this event. So, you know, if it's not on the list, it doesn't mean it's not eligible. It just means we need to look at it and make a good case for it. We really think that FEMA is going to customize and tailor this declaration to allow for certain things that they normally wouldn't because it's unique. For example, standby time in the FEMA public assistance policy has a general limitation of around 14 days. But we know from working with some other hospitals in the country that they've got folks working standby time for weeks and potentially could be months. So we really hope and half expect FEMA to issue some disaster specific guidance to allow eligibility for certain things that may not have been eligible in the past. I'm not going to read this list to you guys, but if there are any questions about what may or may not be eligible, we can certainly talk about it. So slow me down or send me a chat. I haven't seen any messages come through, but that might be because I don't have my little chat window up. But let's move on. At the end of this, I'll ask Chris, or maybe I'll do it myself if I can get everybody's contact. I'll send you guys some links with information that may be handy. One of those things is FEMA's, I think it's called simplified application process. FEMA would really like for their applicants and those that assist public assistance applicants to drive the recovery themselves without having to focus on whether or not we have a FEMA rep to drive the recovery. So I think it's going to give us the ability to really expedite this process. So I've got a question here. If OT is on this list, what about hazard pay for frontline nursing? Would that bump in pay be included? It very well could be. I would venture to say yes, although it's hard to speak in definitive terms for this type of event simply because we're not sure what FEMA is going to do. Our job as consultants is to sit down and understand what you guys are going through. tie your activities and the expenses related to those activities to FEMA's policy, and not just the policy in the book, but also past precedent through searching through the appeals database, looking at past decisions that were made that may justify reimbursement for some of the actions that you guys have taken. So just because it may not be in the book doesn't mean it's not eligible. I think for the example, I'm not sure who that was, Kay Brigadis, to address your specific question, if hazard pay is outlined in your organization's pay policy, it very well could be a reimbursable expense. I know for one of our other clients, they have a hazard pay stipulation in their pay policy that allows them to basically get a daily stipend, which they can require to be used on childcare. So childcare facilitates their employees' ability to continue going to work because all of their kids are at home. And so that's sort of what we're crafting a narrative around to justify, but to be honest, we're not completely certain how FEMA is going to address that. So must have a policy on hazard pay, exactly. One more, if there are severances due to business interruption, could that also be a COVID specific response? That sounds like lost revenue or operating expense type of expense. I'm not certain that would be eligible, but Each one of these things is going to have all sorts of different nuances. So when we get into the weeds and we actually start looking at what your expenses may be, that's when we'll really start tapping into that gray area in FEMA's policy to make things eligible. It's covered in Hurricane Harvey because we had a policy in place. So Marisha's comment was that the OT and bonus was covered during Harvey because there was a policy in place prior to the disaster. So that's a really good point. That's really what FEMA is going to look at. So let's talk about Grants Portal. So FEMA Grants Portal is the predecessor to IMI. IMI is still used, so you might see that tossed out or tossed around here and there. Basically, the sub-grant applications or PWs are developed in FEMA Grants Portal. So that's where we'll answer questions and upload documentation and review our projects. But ultimately, they make it into IMI, which eventually feeds into another system that, lo and behold, runs on DOS to actually issue and make obligations and get money flowing. Eventually, those other platforms will be decommissioned, but everything is done right there within Grants Portal. It's something that each one of you folks will have access to. We really like to gain access as consultants to manage that process for you because it allows us to really keep our finger on the pulse, not only as to where the project is at in the process, but also to assist in the development. And we're going to get into that. So getting into the portal is pretty easy. If you're a new applicant, meaning you've never had a Grants Portal account, there is a process to follow. Generally, that happens through the state. But what I'm hearing is that there is a new process where you can apply for a Grants Portal account electronically without having to have the state manually authorize an account for you. But if we already have accounts, it's really just a matter of logging back into that account and submitting your RPA directly through Grants Portal. Once you're in the system, you can go in, I believe it's under Manage Personnel unless they've changed it. You can actually go into the system and authorize access for other people, such as myself. For example, I have access for the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority. I just came off that project as the project director, managing about probably a $12 billion recovery. And myself and some of our other personnel have access to the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority's Grants Portal system, so we can go in and shepherd these projects through the process. So the first step in the process is that damage inventory. It really lays the foundation for all of your other subgrants. It's literally just a spreadsheet. I'll show you what it looks like in a second, but it predicates project formulation. Basically, everything you put on that damage inventory is ultimately going to be assigned to individual projects based on where those expenses logically should be organized. And really, that's up to you as the applicant to tell FEMA and for us as a team to help shape your recovery and shape your projects so that your expenses are represented in the buckets that you would like them to be represented in. Sometimes there's a lot of strategy that goes behind that. For example, if we have some expenses that may be gray and don't really fit within the lines of FEMA's public assistance policy, what you'll see us do and see many other people who've gone through this time and time again is separate those expenses out onto their own project. Because everything else that we have may be a slam dunk, you know, our overtime, our PPE, our masks, our tests, maybe all that stuff is obviously eligible, and we know there won't be any issues with it. And we don't want to hold the bulk of your funding up by including something that may be gray and may take a little bit of time for FEMA to analyze and review. So we may separate those costs out. So that's really where the strategy comes into play. But it includes just some basic information. I'll show you what it looks like right now. We can actually download this template straight out of FEMA Grants Portal. We can complete it for you. And as long as we don't edit the format of this spreadsheet, we can upload it straight into the portal. I would caution us to have more than one person working with this form, because once we change the format, you basically can't use it because the system, the Grants Portal system, is designed to read this information exactly as it appears on this form. But it is a really handy tool because it means if you have 1,000 different things that you would like to include on your damage inventory, you don't have to one by one enter them into the portal. You can simply slap them into this spreadsheet and upload them in bulk into the system. The downside to that is that once you do that, if you need to say start over, you can't delete them in bulk, you have to delete them one by one. So once we upload it into the system, we should feel really confident that it's our final version. You can always upload more once you have the bulk of your damages uploaded into the damage inventory. You can always add to that. It doesn't really lock until a certain point, but it's a really handy tool, and we can walk you through using it. So once we've got our damage inventory completed, we're going to roll right into project formulation, and that's sort of a misnomer. I wish they would have identified this step in the process differently or with a different name, because it's really not the formulation of your project. It's really just an assignment of those damage inventory items into specific subgrants. So we'll take items 1, 3, 7, and 8 because they're all related to establishing satellite testing facilities, and we'll put them in their own project worksheet. And those project worksheets within Grants Portal will show you exactly which DI numbers and DI items are included in that project. So we want to make sure we address all of them through one project or another. Here's some kind of what we talked about earlier, some strategy behind how we might organize those projects and assign those D items into projects. So sometimes, especially with permanent work damages where we have 3, 4, 5 different facilities that may all be damaged, and they each have an individual say insurance policy, that would be a reason to include those in separate projects because we don't want to muddle deductibles and things of that nature. But in this case, I think we'll strategize behind categorizing your expenses, obviously, and tracking them against the COVID-19 response, and then subcategorizing and getting a little more granular into exactly what those expenses were incurred for. So was it for masks? Was it for quarantine expenses, or was it for something else? And as long as we can sort of see how we want to organize those expenses, I think that may drive how we separate your DI items into projects. So once we have a project formulated and organized in the system, the next step in the process for every single subgrant application, and just to make it clear, you won't have one, you'll probably have 1 to 5, or I've seen 1,000 projects for a single applicant before. For each project, you'll have an essential elements of information section. We call that the EEI, and FEMA's got literally, they have a book about that thick. It's called the Fat Book, if you could believe that. FEMA acronyms and terminology, I believe, and all it is acronyms. So like I said, if I speak in acronyms, slow me down. I see a question here. Would additional costs associated with developing an isolation room or wing be eligible, including minor and major remodel? It very well could be. We're talking about turning on a wing that was previously not in use for one of our clients right now, and retrofitting that facility or that wing of their facility to operate as a quarantine facility. And I fully believe that that's going to be an eligible expense. So that's a really good example. So the EEI section is really just a series of questions. It's sort of like, you get those surveys on the phone, they say, hey, do you watch TV? And you say, yes. And then it leads to another question. Well, what channel do you watch? Okay, what shows do you watch? And it develops over time based custom to your answers to those questions. If you say no, then the survey's over, right? The EEI section works the exact same way. So they'll ask what types of activities took place, what did you do, how much did you spend, how did you get the work done, so on and so forth. And that questionnaire is required for every project, and it's really important because it predicates our documentation requirements. So once we complete the question section of the EEI, it actually develops a documentation requirement, which we then extract. We forward on to the folks who are responsible for gathering and providing that documentation. We organize it, review it, upload it straight into the system, and process the project onward. We're going to take a look at what it looks like here in a second. I kind of got ahead of that last slide, and we talked about exactly what the EEI involves, but here's an extract of what is actually in the EEI. This is straight out of the system. This is a PDF version of the EEI so that it's a little more portable. We don't have to be in the system to look at it, but this is just a representative example of the types of things that they're looking for through that EEI section. And here's some of the different questions they're going to ask, and let's focus in on this emergency medical care section, because that's kind of where we live right now, right? So was the emergency medical care and support occurring within the declared area? Obviously, I think our county is included in that, right? Care costs extend 30 days past the declaration date. If so, Did they extend the eligible time frame? And then a series of a bunch of other questions. You guys can read it on your own time. I'm not going to read it to you. But based on your answers to these questions, we not only provide our justification to FEMA for why we did things, which sort of paints the narrative. Remember, we've got somebody who may be 1,000 miles away reviewing these projects who has no idea what you guys are going through. So by answering these questions, it provides us the opportunity to justify what we did. I see a question down here from R. Duncan. Is there one EEI per grant, or do they combine those? And the answer to that is there is one EEI per grant. So per subgrant application or project worksheet PW, there'll be one EEI section. Because each subgrant may be different, right? So we may have done our work for this EEI, for this project via contract, but we did all of our work for this contract or this project via force account labor, meaning your own folks. And so those are going to have completely different documentation requirements. That's why there's an EEI per subgrant. So let's talk about your expectations really quick. I went through that really, really fast. I know that we all probably have a ton of questions, and we're going to spend some time here in a second to talk about what you guys may want to discuss or any of the concerns you may have. But it's important to remember that I believe Health and Human Services is still the lead federal agency. I don't know if they've changed that, but in terms of the reimbursement piece, obviously FEMA is in the driver's seat. But what's important to remember, the reason I mention this is because when other federal programs turn their emergency relief or whatever they call it grant programs on, if there is funding available through those other federal programs, they're the first at the trough, right? So for example, if the Federal Highway Administration turns their program on, it's called the Emergency Relief Program, FEMA requires applicants that would otherwise be eligible for FHWA money to seek that money first before FEMA would consider it. And even if those other federal agencies do not provide funding for those things, if those costs are eligible for those programs, they may not be eligible for the public assistance program. Now, we don't really know exactly how FEMA is going to address the potential crossover, but it's something that we all want to be aware of. For example, our childcare costs were a big question mark and still are. We're not sure how that's going to be addressed, because if FEMA provides any direct individual assistance aid that would otherwise pay for that, then that might not be an eligible expense for the hospital or for these entities. But those are questions that will continually come up because, as I said, everybody's situation is different. Everybody's doing something a little different based on their operational area. And it's up to us as a team to justify how those things work. That's really all I have, everybody. If we want, we can do a full 2-3 day class on this thing. I don't think anybody wants to sit through that and see my ugly mug on this thing for 3 full days, but totally happy to get into some discussion and answer questions. Must have a dunce number and Sam's account. Yep, that's correct. If anybody needs any help doing that, we can assist in walking you through that process. I can absolutely provide a copy of the slide deck. I believe I sent it to Amanda this last night or this morning. I can't remember when that was. I feel like
yeah, everyone, we'll send it out and we'll also post it on our resource page along with a recording of this Zoom call as well.
Thanks, Amanda. Anything else? Do we want to get in the weeds on anything in particular?
Yeah, this is George. I just have a question about our members are all nonprofits. Does that put us in a unique position here in terms of applying for this assistance?
Sometimes under a major disaster declaration, it might have for permanent work categories, but you guys are in a different, you're in a critical private nonprofit category as far as FEMA looks at their applicants. And you're, as long as your 501c3 and your charters are all up to date and your IRS designation is correct, I don't think we're going to have any unique challenges. But, we're sort of bracing for additional guidance as it comes out of FEMA headquarters. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't think we're going to have any challenges on claiming our Category B costs.
This is Marcia. When we applied for Hurricane Harvey, due to the fact that we were medical and nonprofit, we were the highest tier, and we've been prioritized as such. So like the churches and the synagogues, they were a lower tier than healthcare. And I don't know, I would imagine, we don't know, but for category, and don't we think right now we may only have category B for this, not other? Is that what I read?
So the major disaster declarations that I've seen so far only authorize category B emergency protective measures. That's correct. And I've actually personally gone through the process of including other categories of work under a major disaster that didn't already initially include those other categories of work. And the process really consists of having to have impact on a large scale throughout the operational area. So for the state of Texas in this case, impact in those other categories of work. And for a COVID-19 pandemic response type of event, I can't imagine a scenario where we may have permanent work damages. But then again, never say never. Who knows, what's on the horizon. But for now, let's plan on just those category B expenses. I see a question here too, actually. Do you have to be a nonprofit to apply? The answer to that is yes and no. Municipal agencies, state agencies are also eligible for the program. So your cities, states, counties, et cetera, and then special districts. 501c3 nonprofits are eligible. So if you are a for-profit entity, then you're probably not eligible for assistance under the program. Do we have to, when do we have to take the first step? Right now, even though we're early and don't know what our expenses are ultimately going to be? Great question. So you can submit your RPA as soon as you want, assuming the state and FEMA is ready to accept them. There's no reason you can't go ahead and apply for the program. You don't have to be ready at all. FEMA's not ready. They're not ready to process your documentation and look at it. So we are ahead of the game. So I would say apply for the program and continue aggregating and tracking your expenses. Really, the advice we've been giving at this point to our clients is to create a unique cost center accounting code so that your finance and accounting folks have the ability to run reports and draw up anything associated with those codes, those cost centers. And I recommend going a level down and maybe even 2 levels down and subcategorizing your expenses as it relates to this event, because it's going to make project formulation for the reimbursement process that much easier. A couple more questions. What is the rough time frame from completing the DI once we complete the RPA? So once FEMA has what they call the recovery scoping meeting, it's really the kickoff meeting. You have 60 days to identify your damages to FEMA. So there's some strategy behind that, and I'll get into it. Really, that damage inventory is our mechanism for reporting damages to FEMA within 60 days, right? FEMA's the biggest violator of their own timelines out there. So that 60-day window is a little squishy. What we'll do is we'll take that damage inventory, we'll complete it, but we'll include some vague damage inventory items on there. And we do that because it gives us the opportunity to throw things in the bucket later if we didn't explicitly call them out on the damage inventory. So for example, we're not going to say we bought masks, gloves, gowns, and shields. Instead, we might just say we bought PPE. That allows us to say, well, we bought PPE then, and we're also going to buy more PPE in the future, so let's throw those costs into the bucket later, instead of painting ourselves into too tight of a box. I hope that answers your question. But even if we turn the damage inventory in and meet that 60-day deadline and that damage inventory gets locked, because it doesn't preclude us from claiming things that were not originally included on the DI. It's a process. It's within the system, built in. You request a late submission against your DI. That late submission goes straight to the public assistance group supervisor, and as long as the justification's good, I have never seen a late DI rejected. But then again, never say never. I'm out here in FEMA Region 9. I hope that answers your question. So a county-owned NF. What is an NF? I'm sorry, help me out on your acronyms.
Nursing facility.
Nursing facility, okay. Yes, it could be, it probably would be eligible if it's county owned. Not just county owns the building, but the business, that the organization that operates the nursing facility, if that's county owned, I think that would be an eligible applicant. Any other questions? Oh, here we go. Can organizations submit a couple of months worth of costs, and assuming this goes longer, then submit again? Absolutely. So 2 different ways we can do that. Number one, we write one project for the work that's been completed, and then just process it just like that. Or we write one project for the work that has been completed and include in that project work that has not been completed. What that allows us to do is take an estimate, include that in the original project, submit that to FEMA, and then once those to be completed projected estimated costs are actually incurred, then we go back to FEMA and say, hey guys, we want to draw down against that money that we estimated expenses on. Here's our receipts for that. Can we please, get the balance of what we asked for? Anything over a certain threshold as well is considered a large project. I have to look at what it is for this disaster event. It's somewhere around 150 grand. So any project over 150 grand, we'll call it. That's not the number. Those projects are paid based on actual costs. So if we have a project for $500,000, but it actually costs us $2 million, as long as the expenses are eligible and the work is eligible and in alignment with the scope of work outlined in that project worksheet, then the actual cost is eligible for reimbursement.
So this is Marcia again. I feel like a talking head, but we would like to get your suggested contract for engagement, your list of references, and just some testimonials from these high-profile companies that you listed that you've done business for. As 7 Acres, the main FEMA person here, it is not an easy process. So somebody that is tried and true and knows how to get you through the process will be invaluable to all of us. And a couple of suggestions is every purchase order that you issue that you think is COVID related, please put COVID-19 on. Do not mix ordering general items with COVID items if you can. Like if you order your toilet paper, do your best to put that on a separate PO for your Purell. So anything you can do to keep normal operating separate from emergency supplies will help you in the long run tremendously. Be fastidious that you are using group purchasing, that you have some way of proving the price, because you know what we're paying for some of these supplies are just going to be outrageous. I don't know how they're going to handle that, but keep comparison prices, keep documentation of what comparison is. And if you don't have a SAMS account, you need to get that. And then we'd like to make sure that we have the access to you, Alan, so we can pursue, because you would want us to each have a contract with you. Is that not correct? Each organization would contract with you individually.
I believe so, but I'll let Don and Chris address the contracting side of things. I'm the program guy, so we'll let those folks. Don and Chris, do you have any guidance on that?
Chris, you want to go or you want me to?
Would you mind, please?
No, absolutely. Right. I believe at this point, it will be necessary for each individual entity to file to sign their own individual contract. Just because you're going to be required as an entity to submit your own RPA and go through that process on the front end. We have looked at ways of doing buying cooperatives and setting those up, which we might still be able to do as we go forward, as we emerge from the emergency contracting ability that FEMA has given us for this. We got FEMA guidance last week that the exigent and emergency contracting rules will be in place, which means you're free to sign an emergency contract immediately if you'd like to with us or any other firm that deals with the FEMA PA side of things. When those exigent and emergency conditions are lifted at some point in the future, it will be necessary to go out an RFP. So what we're going to do in the meantime is look at the best and most efficient way to do that, whether that is going through a buying cooperative, maybe creating a new buying cooperative, because at some point, it may be 3 months from now, maybe 6 months from now, we're not exactly sure when that's going to be. When those exigent and emergency situations are lifted, you will have to go out to a traditional RFP. And we're right now, we're just kind of studying the most efficient way to do that. It's a long answer. The short answer is yes, at this point, it will probably be necessary for each individual facility to go out to RFP.
Great answer, Don.
I'm sorry, not RFP, sign an emergency contract and then go out to RFP later.
Perfect. I am seeing two more questions here that I'd love to address. First is from M. Cummings. If a community converts a skilled room to a quarantine room, can lost revenue be claimed to be considered possibly a percent? I'll be fully honest here. I don't think so. Lost revenue is outlined explicitly as a not eligible expense in the FEMA PA PPG, the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide. That doesn't mean that the feds don't have the capacity to assist in some other way. Now, we also don't know how they're going to tailor this program to allow for things like that, because you're asking the same question that every other client that we have engaged with has also asked. Because if, for example, these hospitals are there's a moratorium on elective procedures, and those elective procedures generally are what offsets their Medicare and indigent patient care.
Let me just turn down this thing. It's more important for me right now to.
Do we have a question on the phone?
Hold on 1 second.
Just a reminder to mute unless you're asking a question.
So back to that lost revenue question, I don't think so, but that won't preclude us from at least asking. So we got a question yesterday when we were giving this presentation, and someone said, is it fraud or dishonest for us to include expenses on our claim that we know probably aren't eligible? And I said, absolutely not. The no is free, right? So let's give FEMA the opportunity to tell us why not, and we will try to craft a narrative around why we think it should be eligible, because the impact to you guys is going to be significant. I'm sure it already has been. The other question is, are tidal basins fees for filing the RPA considered a reimbursable expense from FEMA? Maybe not for filing the RPA. Under the new FEMA management cost policy, it probably will give us a little bit of latitude you guys would be allowed to claim those indirect expenses that aren't specifically associated with the development of a specific subgrant application or project worksheet. But definitely our costs for assisting in the development, the organization, the narrative, the review and aggregation of your documentation for each specific subgrant, each project worksheet, our cost to you for doing that is considered management cost. And FEMA does have a policy in place that allows you to claim management costs up to, I believe, 5% for each project based on the new guidance. So yeah, normally our fees, or at least a good portion of our fees, fall into that category. I hope that answers the question. Per staffing, if emergency staffing or agents, is emergency staffing or agency staffing recoverable? That's a really broad question. So what FEMA is going to ask, and let's be prepared to answer this, how is the staffing expense related to the COVID-19 response? So as long as we can answer that question, then overtime, definitely eligible, as long as we can make a case for it. Some straight time is probably also going to be eligible for reassigned employees, for folks that we put on, say we put them on an emergency worker type basis, or there's all sorts of different ways we can position staffing expenses to hopefully maximize what we do have available to us. General rules are overtime and then those above and beyond. So say there's hazard pay, or some, I've seen some agencies, especially in East Texas back during Hurricane Ike, had 2 and 3 times pay policies. They'd get double time or triple time overtime, and those policies were in place before the event, and FEMA paid them. I'm not saying we should go out and do that, but that's just an example of how FEMA looks at those staffing expenses.
Okay, I'm going to close it off. I'm going to shut
Okay. What are the next steps then? What do people need to do if they want to engage you in moving ahead with contracts and you know, getting all the paperwork started.
Chris and Don, I think next step would be we have a pretty basic emergency contract that we've been using. We're working on a 90-day basis under that emergency contract with a not to exceed and all the different clauses that we know need to be included in those contracts, and we can go back and forth on verbiage. But that's an effort that Chris and Don have been taking on. We will say, however, and Don mentioned it earlier, and I think it's worth mentioning again. You know, if this event calms down tomorrow, not that it will, but if it does, and our exigent circumstances, as FEMA has agreed we are operating under, if those exigent circumstances have sort of been quelled, then FEMA may come back and say, hey guys, you know, things are not back to normal per se, but we believe that you should be able to go out and competitively procure you know, services, which really is our justification for going back to our standard procurement processes. And we'll make sure to tell you when we think that makes sense. But for right now, a 90-day basis is kind of what we're working on. Chris or Don, do you guys have anything to add on next steps? I think we can get everybody who's interested a contract.
And just Marshall, why can't we do a RFP and post it in the paper and do that through LeadingAge? Have you ever done a group RFP? Because it takes a lot of work to do that. But if we showed our due diligence up front, TDM will be very, very happy. So is it possible to follow the rules together, and it's easier to follow the rules together and use the same as LeadingAge? Because we have an organized Texas group purchasing organization. I mean, I'm just saying, to take a lot of work and a lot of consultant time for individual organizations to post it, to recruit, vet these people. If we could do that once as LeadingAge under that GPO, and then we would have that available, do you think that TDM and FEMA would accept that? I
think so too. My gut tells me that a joint purchasing agreement, or whatever you guys call it, I think that's what you called it, a group purchasing agreement. That does sound pretty safe to me. I agree. I'm always, I'm sort of conservative as it comes to procurement. I always, if you have the ability to go out and advertise and put that out now, that saves you the trouble down the road. And it also gives us a lot longer time frame. It may, you know, if we can do that and say we do it for, you know, a year or whatever it is, that does allow us to really stretch out and not have to worry about when that finish line is, you know, rapidly approaching, when things do calm down. But maybe Chris has a different perspective. Chris?
So I think it's definitely something that could happen. But like she said, it's the due diligence that has to be shown back to TDM and FEMA, because FEMA notoriously has been very skeptical of purchasing agreements, especially during disasters. But with that said, it's not to say that they can refuse every one of them. If you show your perfect due diligence, that you followed the 2 CFR 200 and all the procurement rules correctly under the federal guidelines, then they really shouldn't have an issue. So I think it's really going to be about how it's documented on your end to be able to show FEMA that you followed all the rules. But to your point, it would be much easier for you to do all the work one time than to have to do it 200 times for everybody. And for us, it would be a lot easier than responding to each individual RFP as well. So I definitely think that's something that could be explored a lot further, and it's probably a good option.
So George, I would be the door to FEMA and TDM with what we're doing and asking. I think they would tell us that it looks like we're following procurement. If I go through with my contacts, they may shut the door on it and say, no, it's a total different project. But I believe that if we try to meet procurement up front, that TDM and FEMA should be extremely pleased with this. And if you do your RFP for all of the organizations in Texas that are interested, why can't Tidal Basin figure out how to write the RFP, and we open it up to other people like Tidal Basin, and we find somebody, and that we've secured our rates, we've secured our contract, the things that we want in that, and that we've proved our due diligence. I mean, there's probably at least 100 of us that would be interested and would benefit from this.
I would advise, Chris, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we can certainly provide advisory type assistance as far as the RFP is concerned, but actually assisting in writing it would exclude us from competing on it. Chris, am I off on that?
Yeah, that's correct. But we can advise you with some general language and things like that to make sure that it's going to meet what the rules should say, but we definitely can't write it for you.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that that individual organizations should sign an agreement with you in the short term, and then in the longer term, we should do an RFP process to sort of get everything under one umbrella. Does that make sense? Am I reading that correctly?
Chris, that's a really good question. Chris, let's take this offline and talk about how we manage that on the back end, because through our cost tracking processes and system, it will make it really difficult to keep things clean and organized, which is going to be a requirement on the FEMA end to claim our fees. So an effort to make sure that that's preserved, I'd like to be able to advise you after a little bit of discussion with Chris and our procurement group. Is that okay?
Sure.
Chris,
George, this is Don. I'm making sure I'm correct on this. Y'all currently have a group purchasing agreement in place?
We do. We have a group purchasing organization.
Okay. All right. I'll get with you later to get some more information on that, and we can just see if we can tailor that.
Okay.
what I'm leaning.
Everyone knows, if you go to Tidal Basin's website, is tidalbasingroup.com. They do have testimonials and a lot of information about the company, and if you're all interested.
We've also got an active blog where we're trying to stay involved and provide communication. And right now, I think the best thing that our industry can provide is information. Because there's so much misinformation flying around out there. And yeah, so in the meanwhile, both Chris and my contact information is in the back end of this presentation. If there was any questions, just shoot us an email. We are getting a little overloaded, so be patient with us. But anytime, shoot a text, email, or even call. Be happy to help. Even just answer some questions, off the cuff. I do have one more question here from Crystal Laza. She's asking if Tidal Basin considering offering a discounted management fee for LeadingAge Texas members. I'm not part of the pricing team, but maybe Don or Chris can speak to that.
Hey, this is Chris. So to my knowledge, we are locked in with most of our rates because we offer GSA rates, which are government general schedule rates. So we're not allowed to deviate from those once they're set by the GSA.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And also, that's probably going to be the same answer that any firm with a GSA rate would give you, because you really do get in trouble if you deviate from them.
Okay. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I just want to reiterate, first of all, thank you to the folks from Tidal Basin, Alan, Chris, and Don for making this happen. It's a critical time. We've got a lot of things going on. Everyone's getting overloaded with information, as has been stated. So this is an opportunity to recover some of those costs. I hope it's been informative. We will have this has been being recorded. We're going to put this up on our resource page on COVID. We have a lot of stuff there, but and if you know of other people who are not who did not participate today but would benefit from this, please let them know, because if indeed we go through this RFP process through our group purchasing organization, this will be a great benefit to LeadingAge Texas members. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. And also want to make sure that alert you to our Tuesday calls. Every Tuesday at 1 o'clock, we've been having calls with members on the response to COVID. We had an epidemiologist this past week. This coming week, we're going to have speakers to talk about crisis communication. So please be sure to register for that if you can. So thank you all and stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.